is after unpacking the glories of the promise of God and how it is a gift through faith. Yet some of Paul's listeners were going, well, what about the law? Surely the law is to be obeyed, or what's the point of it? So Paul teases out the freedom of the promise and the purpose of the law. And he starts with his last will and testament, and I love some of those scenes you'll see in the films where you've a room filled with tense family members as the lawyer reads out the last will and testament of the deceased, and you can watch the siblings jostle for position, ready to claim the estate, the car, the holiday home, the heirlooms, when an agitated hush descends on the room as it's discovered that the servant girl at the back gets the whole lot. You see, sometimes the grace of God can seem scandalous. As it appears, the undeserving gets off scot-free and goes home with all the inheritance. And if you've been listening to anything that Paul has been saying in Galatians, you'll realise that God's grace is indeed scandalous, because no one will be justified through their own efforts. None deserve God's favour, not even Abraham or Paul. It's a gift. Paul's main point in the opening verse is that just as a human contract is binding, so is the promise of God. In fact, even more so. He says this, let me take an example from everyday life. Just as no one can set aside or add to a human covenant that has duly been established, so it is in this case. So what Paul is saying is if God has made a promise, he will keep it. Paul argues then that the coming of the law 430 years later through Moses doesn't nullify the promise. Just like a will, the inheritance comes through the promise. And he says that in verse 18, for if the inheritance depended on the law, then it no longer depends on the promise. But God in his grace gave it to Abraham through a promise. I want to take you back now to Abraham briefly, and you may remember that God promised Abraham his descendants would be as numerous as the stars, and that all nations would be blessed through his offspring. In Genesis 15, we find Abraham doubting God's promise because he's still no children, and he seeks God's reassurance. So God, we're told, cuts a covenant with him or makes an agreement with him. Now, if you or I make a loan agreement, for example, with a bank, we are simply probably signing our life away, agreeing to loads of small print that we probably haven't read but probably should, and that binds us to repay the loan or there will be penalties. It also binds the bank to release the money and whatever else is involved. In those days, agreements or contracts were a little more graphic. They were different. Two parties would sacrifice animals such as cows, rams and goats, and literally they would cut them in half with a space between them. And to ratify the covenant, or to shake on the agreement, the two parties would walk between the dead animals and shake on it, effectively saying that if either side broke the agreement, they deserved to be cut up and cut off, just like the animals around them. Very strange, but true. However, in Abraham's instance, here in Genesis 15, there's something startling happens. Just before the agreement is made, God puts Abraham into a deep sleep, and he confirms to him his promise. And he talks through a little bit of the history that's coming. Then symbolically, Abraham sees this vision of a blazing fire pot representing the presence of God passing between the dead animals that had been laid out. Effectively, God was declaring that if he didn't keep his promise, he was putting himself on the line. He was willing to be cut up and cut off. So let's recall again what Paul said in Galatians, and tie it all together. Paul is basically saying that the fulfillment of these ancient promises will be found in Jesus Christ alone. He says the promises that were spoken to Abraham and to his seed, and he basically said his seed is Christ. Paul has asked us to keep the cross before our eyes, and God knew that Abraham and his offspring would never be able to walk uprightly. And that's why he provided the law, to make us aware of our failings and to drive us back to God. The cross is the most significant demonstration of his commitment to us that you will ever see. You see, God sent his son, our high priest, who was willingly cut to pieces because we couldn't keep the law. He paid the penalty of the law that we couldn't meet. He bore the curse of the broken covenant, both of which should have been ours. You see, Jesus was torn in two, offering complete forgiveness and unlimited access to God to all who believe. And the undeserving, like you and me, can grasp this salvation through faith alone. You see, the spiritual inheritance of Abraham is not the land, but the personal, experiential knowledge of God himself. The inheritance of this promise to Abraham is imparted through the laying down of Jesus' life. The blessing of Abraham is freely given to all who believe, and we lay hold of these benefits through faith alone, a simple trust in what God has promised and in what he has done for us. Verse 18, he says, "For if the inheritance depended on the law, then it no longer depends on the promise, but God in his grace gave it to Abraham through a promise." So this covenant in no way relies on Abraham. God had deliberately put him to sleep. It relies only on God. And Paul is pointing out here the impossibility of attaching obedience, performance-related demands to this promise of life. And this is good news. This blessing can be ours and yours today. God's love knows no bounds, as he's provided a way of rescue for sinners such as us. God's grace has been aptly described as God's riches at Christ's expense. And Paul is excited by this, and he passionately defends it. And because he wants you and I to find it. I'm your host, Matt Tuttleby of Bundoran Bible Reflections. Have a great week.